Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will be about the fifth module of the Section 2 in the IBMS digital registration portfolio called Research and Development. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. I will then discuss evidence justification and some ideas for evidence candidate could use in this module. I will finish this video with some helpful tips to make candidates' portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the fifth module of the second section. These are the learning outcomes candidates should be able to meet when they have completed this module. They should be able to analyze qualitative and quantitative data and demonstrate a logical and systematic approach to problem solving. Critically evaluate research articles and other evidence to inform their own practice. Use current research in their plan to generate hypotheses, design experiments, and analyze novel data to develop their knowledge and expertise. When they complete this module, they should come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that they have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. The task is, prepare a written report on a workplace-based activity, or summary of final year university research project, that includes statistical analysis, data interpretation, and evaluation of the study design. So let's break this down into smaller pieces. The part is asking the candidate to prepare a written report. So they need to write this piece of evidence in a written report style. Next part of the task is asking them to write about a workplace-based activity. So they should consider tasks they are doing in their practice. The task is also suggesting an alternative approach in which they can write a summary final year project done at the university. If they choose this option, they should write it in a style of a summary, not a written report. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. The first part of the advice is telling the candidate that the evidence should summarize a piece of research carried out in the lab. Alternatively, summarize their research project completed at the university, if it is relevant to the biomedical science. Next part of the advice is asking them to include the approach to experimental design, troubleshooting, data collection, statistical analysis, and interpretation. What experimental design did the candidate choose? Did they encounter any problems? If so, how did they overcome them? What type of data did they collect and how have they analyzed and interpreted them? What statistical analysis did they use? Next part of the advice is asking them to demonstrate their understanding of how developing their research skills, study design, and evaluation of data positively impacted their lab, or their final project. How did their department benefited? Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, recognize the value of research to the critical evaluation of practice. Candidate needs to recognize the value of research to the critical evaluation of the practice. BMS practice is evidence-based practice, and they think about it, research generates evidence. Does the candidate recognizes the value of research for their practice? Do they see how the research improves their practice? Can they give an example how research changed their practice recently? Candidate could consider improvement of diagnostic accuracy, improvement of methods, developing and guidelines based on new findings, identifying and filling gaps in knowledge, enhancing communication, driving innovation, improving patient management and outcome, quality assurance, and so on. Healthcare is constantly evolving, hence the need for CPD and up-to-date practice. The second standard is, use statistical packages and present data in an appropriate format. Candidate needs to demonstrate they can use statistical packages and present data in an appropriate format. Does the candidate know what statistical packages are? What statistical analysis can they use? What statistical tests can the candidate use? What statistical tools are they aware of? What data presentation formats can they use? Candidate could consider descriptive, inferential, predictive, prescriptive or exploratory tests like student t-test, ANOVA, regression analysis, chi-square test, factor cluster analysis, tools like Python, Jamovi, or SPSS, data presentation via tables, graphics, or reports. The third standard is, design experiments, report, interpret and present data using scientific convention, including application of SI units and other units used in biomedical science. Candidate needs to design experiment, report, interpret and present data using scientific convention, including application of SI and other units used in biomedical science. Can the candidate design experiments? Do they know how to process generated data? Do they know what skills are important for designing and conducting experiments? Can they interpret and present the data? Can they use SI units? Candidate could consider design hypothesis, methodology, accuracy, replication, compliance, controls, various ways to interpret, present and report generated data, key skills like proficiency, communication skills, adherence to standards, use of specialist equipment and statistical analysis. Those are the standards candidate has in mind when writing their mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidate's choice and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 7 HCPC standards. As the trainer, you need to set some tasks or questions for the candidate to complete that would allow them to meet the standards. If you download the module descriptors for the portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards candidate has to meet by 2 pieces of choice evidence. The first standard is, demonstrate a logical and systematic approach to problem solving. Candidate needs to demonstrate logical and systematic approach to problem solving. How does the candidate solve problems? Do they think what the problem is before they take actions? Do they try to understand what the problem is before try to resolve it? Do they have the necessary understanding to problem solve? How do they approach a problem? Is their approach methodical? Candidate could consider problem identification, root cause analysis, brainstorming, potential solutions, action planning, action implementation, execution, monitoring, verification, and evaluation of results. The second standard is, use research, reasoning and problem-solving skills when determining appropriate actions. Candidate needs to use research, reasoning, and problem-solving skills when determining appropriate actions. What research is available to the candidate to problem solve? What are their reasons for solving the problem the way they did? What problem-solving skills do they have? Is their problem-solving evidence-based? Candidate could consider information gathering, critical thinking, reasoning, decision-making, analysis, communication, documentation, adaptability, and so on. The third standard is, demonstrate awareness of the principles and applications of scientific inquiry, including the evaluation of treatment efficacy and the research process. Candidate needs to be aware of principles and applications of scientific inquiry, including evaluation of treatment efficacy and the research process. Does the candidate know what the principles and applications of scientific inquiry are? How can they evaluate treatment efficacy? Candidate could consider principles of scientific inquiry, applications of scientific inquiry, evidence-based practice, empirical evidence, peer review, systematic process, problem-solving, methodology, critical review, continuous improvement, data-driven decisions, for treatment evaluation, clinical trials, meta-analysis, systematic review, outcome measure, measurable changes in disease, extent of response, biomarker analysis, imaging, digital pathology, and so on. The fourth standard is, change their practice as needed to take account of new developments, technologies, and changing contexts. Candidate needs to change their practice, if needed, to take account of new developments, technologies, and changing contexts. Does the candidate know why it is important that they implement new development technologies? Do they know what impact this has on service users, patients, and their care? Is the candidate able to adapt and change their practice? Candidate could consider proactive adaptation, content-dependent, lifelong learning, upskilling, CPD, replacing outdated methods with new, introduction of automation, introduction of digitalization, paper versus electronic documentation, maintaining fitness to practice, maintaining standards, ever-evolving, ever-improving patient care, various impacts on service provided. The fifth standard is, recognize a range of research methodologies relevant to their role. Candidate needs to recognize a range of research methodologies relevant to their role. Does the candidate know what research methodologies are relevant to their role? Can they explain why are those methodologies relevant? Candidate could consider quantitative or qualitative research, generating new data, analyzing existing data, in vitro, in vivo, ex vivo or in silico research, observation or experimental studies, epidemiology, laboratory techniques like cell culture, microscopy, PCR, data collection via interviews, surveys, or case studies and so on. The sixth standard is, critically evaluate research and other evidence to inform their own practice. Candidate needs to critically evaluate research and other evidence to inform their practice. Does the candidate know how to critically evaluate research and other evidence? Do they know research is of a relevant value to their practice? Can they inform their practice by critically evaluating research? Candidate could consider assessing validity, reliability, relevance, applicability of information, analysis of findings and conclusions, understanding the context, overall value of research, objectivity, clarity, trustworthiness of evidence, justification, purpose search, role of the author, identification of bias or conflict of interest and so on. The seventh standard is, engage service users in research as appropriate. Candidate needs to engage service users in research, if appropriate. Does the candidate engage service users in research? If so, how does the candidate engage service users in research? Does the candidate know why it is important to engage service users in research? Candidate could consider consultation, collaboration, co-production, co-design, sharing of results, accessible language, flexibility, methods of engagement, project stages, ethical and practical support, overcoming barriers, empowerment, increasing trust and improved care. Those are standards you have to keep in mind when you are creating questions or selecting tasks for the candidate to complete, as they all have to be met by the two pieces of choice evidence. One more thing that candidate has to include when choosing and writing their evidence, and that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want the candidate to do that piece of evidence. Ask the candidate to read IBMS justifications, as this can form the basis for how they should be justifying their choice of evidence. They should also include which specific standards were met in each evidence. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as your choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good, and can meet several standards, which is what you need and want. And these are some examples of evidence types worth considering for this section as well. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting for the reader, which will be you the training officer and eventually the verifier. Ask them to try to put themselves in your shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share my evidence I used for this module, back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each module. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and indication evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best to meet all the standards. And one more thing, ask them to keep the standards in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several standards. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting questions, tasks, and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.